Hello, folks. As you know, we're going through some topics on deaf education, deaf history, um, just trying to educate the greater community at large, about the deaf community. And that is one of the reasons why this channel exists, is simply for education. So, as you may have seen in a previous video, we were looking at the book When the Mind Hears. All right. It is by Harlan Lane. He's actually the editor of the book. The very first part of it, the entire first 10, 11 chapters, is Lauren Claire's story. If you don't know who Claire is, and you are in America and you have any association with the deaf community, that's a problem. I want to make that very clear. If you do not know who Laurent Claire is, even in just a tiny general sense, we have a problem. So a little history on him. The entire book is his history. Um, but a key factor, he is the person who came from France, who he himself is deaf and a deaf teacher. He came from France to America with Thomas Gallaudet to establish the first school for the deaf in Hartford, Connecticut. Okay. So deaf education in America comes back to him. Okay. So you have to have that understanding that this all comes back to him. So if you if you're a teacher of the deaf anywhere in the United States and you don't know about Laurent Claire, shame. Shame on you. Secondly, get this book. Read this book. You need to understand this book. Um, yeah, there's a lot to it. So previously, we worked a little bit in chapter one, uh, and I talked to you guys about his initial feelings of, hey, they're trying to get rid of me. So uh, it's an interesting little chapter. If you haven't watched that video, go back, see a little bit. But I want to talk a little bit about chapter five. So chapters 2 through 4 kind of go back into kind of the history of the school he was in, some Sicard, some L'Epée. I don't know. I can't speak French. So I can sign. I can't speak French. Um, so the basically some of the abbes that were within the church. Oh, excuse me, things with the French Revolution, so on and so forth. So that is what we're kind of looking at in terms of those chapters. So I wanted to get into a little bit about five because he says some things in here that you really got to catch and understand what he's saying, right? Um, so I'll just read from the beginning of chapter 5. There stands opposed to the true history of my people, whose modern era began when Abbe de l'Epée discovered how to educate us through sign language. Quite another history. It is a record of the efforts of hearing people to supplant the language of the deaf with their language, to replace signs with speech. It calls itself the history of the deaf, yet it is an account not of my people, but of our hearing benefactors, who affirm that the only proper route for elevating the deaf is oral instruction. It is a false history, for I state now and shall soon show that although it spans 3 centuries and a dozen nations, not one person born deaf has ever permanently supplanted his side with speech. I, it breaks my heart. It does. It's insane. Our history of the deaf is nothing more than a history of hearing people, the benefactors, what they did, how they moved. Aren't they great? We whitewashed it, essentially. That's what we did. We hearing washed it. We are a society of ableists. We want everybody to be able to do the things that we do. And if we can't, we pity them. And then the person who rescues them is the hero. Isn't that so wonderful? No, it's not. Can we get over it now? Can we move on? No, we won't. That's the problem. We're an ableist society. We focus on any sort of disability, on how we can fix it, how we can get it better, how we can do such great things despite this disability. Enough. Why can't we just treat humans as humans? Why are these expectations so ridiculous? But when you look back, I started kind of going through, I'm like, how much of deaf history do I know from the hearing benefactor position? Yeah, I learned about who taught the first class. I know who created, and he even talks about him in here, Ponce de Leon. Um, he talks about, uh, well, obviously Sicardo Lepe, but he doesn't necessarily name some of the not great people, but he does when they're separated from him, right? So in his stage where he's writing this, the big opponent to sign language is Thomas Edison. No, I'm sorry, I said that wrong. Alexander Graham Bell, different inventor. Sorry, Edison. Still love you, even though you stole the light bulb. Alexander Graham Bell, who was a teacher of the deaf, who forced oralism, who said that hands and signing was not appropriate. He had, he actually, he pushed a lot. He pushed a lot. He pushed for sterilization. He actually got Helen Keller to also endorse that deaf people should be sterilized so they don't create more deaf people. The I can't. It's just insane. Um, yeah. So he doesn't necessarily call out Alexander Graham Bell because they're both still alive at this time, and so he's not calling trouble to a person who's still living. But he does go back into like 600 AD, and he calls out Bishop John of Haggelstadt. That's a common household name around here, Haggelstadt. Um, but he says that he I love this. Held the tongue of a mute, made over it the sign of the cross, and ordered him to draw his tongue back and speak. Hey, the Bible talks about Jesus performing miracles. We're not against that. Just saying. It's yeah. But one thing that excuse me, one thing that really gets to me is not only is he saying, "Hey, it's all a history about the hearing people and what they've done for us and what they're pushing in their form of education." But it goes through, it's so interesting. Never has the false history been presented with more authority and completeness than in two volumes of the education of the congenitally deaf, written by one of the great intellects and philanthropists in France, Baron Joseph Marie de Geronado, chairman of the governing board of our school, which solicited the work soon after the Abbe Sicard's death. Dozens of hearing authors are cited in the work of this brilliant man who never taught a deaf person anything. And scores of hearing authors in turn have since cited him and criticized each other's citations and cited conflicting views until all of this citing of hearing people has become, for hearing people, the history of deaf people. Worse, deaf children have been led by hearing teachers to learn this so called history and to revere its heroes, who are, not surprisingly, other hearing teachers. That is why I say if you are a teacher of the deaf in 2025 and you do not know who Lorraine Claire is, get out. You are doing a disservice. Get out. Do your research, do your homework, and do your job. You should know the deaf teacher who brought deaf education to America, who was an advocate, a self advocate, and an advocate for his students. You should know he was an advocate for sign language. You should know this man. And if all you know are the hearing teachers, if you know about Thomas Gallaudet and Edward Minor Gallaudet, yeah, they were great guys. Yes, they did great things. We're not knocking that. But they are hearing. If all of our history is about the hearing white man or woman or black or Asian, whatever, if they're all hearing and that's our deaf history, that's a problem. Do your research, see who it is. Because even back then, who were the authors? Who were the ones telling this history? Hearing people about hearing people. They were the ones doing the writing. And now we have this book that is coming from a deaf man. This should be your resource. This should be your understanding. And if it's not, that's a problem. This was not a required reading book in my what did I get a degree in? Deaf studies degree. Jeez. This was a book that was suggested reading. It was on a list of other books you may want to try. I had to read a book from Harlan Lane, and then I kind of went down the rabbit hole of him, and I was like, "Oh, well, what else does he have?" And I came across this book, and I was like, "Well, let's find out." I bought this book off of Amazon for myself because I was getting a degree in deaf studies. I took it upon myself to read this book. Nobody told me to. If you are a teacher of the deaf, you need to do that too. If you are hearing and you're teaching the deaf or the hard of hearing, you need a better understanding. And we have quite a few books that are written by hearing people that are used as textbooks. Go back to what's being written by the deaf. That's what we need. That's the only way we're going to know, right? But it's this trickle down of the hearing writes about this hearing and this hearing writes about that. And they're our heroes. Look what they did. Because we all grew up learning that Alexander Graham Bell was a teacher of the deaf in Boston. Or at least I did because I grew up in Massachusetts. That was one of his MOs. Yes, he invented the telephone, and his mother was deaf, and he married his student, one of his students. He loved those scenarios, who was also deaf. He was friends with Helen Keller. These are the fun facts that we learn about him. We don't learn about the sterilization. We don't learn about the Milan Conference. We don't learn about the atrocity and the evil that he pulled within the deaf community. And that's what we need to know if we're going to understand our deaf community and what they've been through, what they go through every day. Their history has been hearing washed. That's the best way I could phrase it. Their history is hearing washed. Um, so I want to look at one more part that, and really, I mean, we're just in the start of this chapter. We're on the second page of this chapter, y'all. Um, he talks about that bishop, right? And he goes through and he's like, can we just get rid of these people? He has next cited, right? These are those hearing people, is Rudolf Bauer, alias Agricola, if you know your Latin, farmer. He's a professor at Heidelberg who merely mentioned in 1528, so now we're moving up, right? Newer centuries here, that he heard of a deaf man who could write. That's it. Why is his name he heard of a deaf man who could write, so that makes him part of the deaf history? How is Jerome Cardan, physician, astrologer, gambler, withdraw. He simply affirmed that those born deaf could be taught to read without speech. He never tried. John Wilkins, Secretary of the Royal Society, and with him Kenelm Digby, intimate of the English court. Interested in all manner of things, they make mention of the astonishing achievements of a 17th century Spaniard, Juan Pablo Bonet, in teaching the deaf to speak, but they do not tell how, much less repeat the feats. Juan Pablo Bonet wrote the first book on teaching speech to the deaf. It is true, but he probably stole the method and never actually tried it himself. They're writing books upon things that they hear from others and not actually. I heard of Juan Pablo Bonet. Like that was one of the names that we were taught in our deaf studies degree. Yes, absolutely. He came up. So where are the facts behind him that he was actually teaching the deaf? Hmm, it's interesting. So that is where I want to kind of look at this for this week. Where are you getting your sources from? Where are you getting your knowledge, your understanding, right? Like if you're a teacher and you know that the student has an IEP, of course it does, right? Because the ADA. So if we have an IEP that says, little Timmy is deaf, therefore this is what he gets, who's making the decisions on his services? And I know we all mean well. We do. We want what's best. But if you are not deaf, if you are not hard of hearing, and you don't know what he's going through, how are you making the decisions? We know 90% of children who are born deaf are born to hearing parents. 90% of deaf couples who give birth to hearing children. 90%. Come on. We need to have people in the room for the discussions. When it comes to deaf education, if the only person sitting in the room is the student, the only person who's deaf sitting in the room is the student, that's a problem. We need somebody from the outside. We need an advocate. We need somebody from, like if you're in South Carolina, you could probably call up Able up in Columbia. They could probably send someone, right? We need somebody with a background, with an understanding, somebody who's gone through what this student is going through. I didn't go through it. I wasn't deaf as a child. I can't tell you. I can tell you what my friends have told me, but I'm no better than this book stating, well, this friend told me. At least I'm getting resources from deaf friends that I can call upon to share information, but I myself have not gone through it. This is what we're trying to do with ease. We're trying to open up your eyes and open up your minds to help you understand that if you have not gone through it, you should not be the end all be all resource. I say this all the time. This is always my example. And it's funny how this person I use as my example is now even more a part of my life in a laughable way. But I like to say, if my church is hosting a women's Bible study, and so we say we're going to meet at this time, 10 a.m., this room, blah, blah, blah. And sure enough, 9:55, the room is flooded with women, right? Old, young, married, single, moms, not moms, grandmas, all the things, right? If we have all these women sitting in this room and in walks one of our elders who is a man, every woman in there is going to be like, oh, did we go to the wrong room? I could have sworn it was here. Why is he here? Right? It's going to be a thought if it's not out loud voiced. Why is he here? And then if he says, well, I can teach this class, there might be some looks like, technically, yes, you can. Technically, yeah. If you know the Bible, you could teach a Bible study. But you're not a woman. This is a woman's Bible study. This is women. If women are gathered together, why is a man teaching it? Oh, well, I've been married. I have two daughters. I have two sisters. I have a mother. I have aunts. I have cousins who are girls. I've grown up with women in my life. I've always had women in my life. I know women. I can teach this. How long is that Bible study going to last under his tutelage? And that depends really on the church and the foundations and what your beliefs are and uh, you know, where things lie within each person. But I don't think that Bible study is going to last very long. I think on day 1 you have a room full, and on day 2 maybe half, and on day 3 2 or 3. I would wonder if his wife is sitting in that Bible study. I think that would be a key indicator. But I think about those things because If if a man is not leading a women's Bible study, and the same goes vice versa. If there's a men's group, right? If my husband is going to men's group on Tuesday night and somebody's wife shows up and says, "Okay, guys, I'm teaching class tonight," they're gonna be like, "Safe space. We're trying to talk about you women." Like there's that essence of that, right? Right? If you are not deaf, if you are not hard of hearing, it's really hard to be knowledgeable to the fullest extent when you're teaching the deaf and the hard of hearing, right? You need that background, you need that knowledge. And I'm not saying that it's impossible. I'm not saying that you shouldn't. I know wonderful hearing people who are teachers of the deaf who do a darn good job. They are fluent in sign language. They know who speaks, who's signing, who's doing this, who's doing that. They have great interpreters that they work with. They have all of the things that they need, except maybe time, more sleep, money, food, because they're teachers in South Carolina. But there are some who don't have that experience, who don't walk into the classroom understanding deaf history. That is the problem. We're allowing teachers to go into a role because there's a need and they get minimal training and then go, have at it. What kind of education are those kids getting? You see, what we missed in chapters 2, 3, and 4 in this history of l'Epée and the French school for the deaf, what Lorraine Claire says repeatedly is, yeah, we learned. We learned how to copy. We learned how to do French on our hands. They didn't actually use our sign language. They took some pieces of it, but they weren't teaching us in sign language. They were teaching us in French. And they used their hands to mimic French in a way that we could understand so that we could repeat it back. They taught us how to write in French. They taught us how to answer questions in the French. They still didn't accept the French Sign Language as a language. He states it repeatedly. I don't know what chapter, but he states it repeatedly that l'Epée did not respect French Sign Language as an actual language. And they weren't taught in that language. That they were trying to fit that sign language into French standards, into the French grammar, into the French syntax, into all of those things. And he's saying that's not how it works. That's not how it works. Our language doesn't make sense. What Lepe did was add all of these extra things on the hands. So in order to write it was like a 4, 5 word sentence. He said, on our hands, we were producing 20, 30 items so that it was perfect in French. Our language would have had it done in 4 signs. He said, you muddied the waters, basically. And it's so true that that's what happens when we have hearing people teaching in the deaf classroom and they don't have that background. They don't understand what it's like to be deaf. They don't understand the deaf community. They're not involved in the deaf community. They don't understand what's happened and they try to teach everything from their point of view. We have to be willing to learn another perspective. And that's what it comes down to. I know that we're about accessibility. That's our thing, and we're trying to do community accessibility, but that applies to the schools as well. If there are students in there who would prefer to be signing, we should be signing. And I think most schools are trying to do that. And I know that our standards are EIPA, yeah. That the standards for that are very high. And I know that because a friend of mine helped to establish those standards, and she is darn good, y'all. She's on top of it. She understands the deaf community. She's in the deaf community. She teaches. She's an interpreter. She's been in this for 30 years, just about. I mean, this is her life. So if you're going to trust somebody, it's her. But that doesn't mean that I've looked at the standards and what they are to take that test. But I also know that I've seen job descriptions coming out of school districts that are not requiring that. that are saying, well, come work for a year or two and then you can take the test. We'll give you some leeway to take the test. Please, we need a warm body, is what they're actually saying. They prefer somebody with the background in that. But if it doesn't happen, and I've seen that firsthand within the last year, where I had a friend that I was like, you could probably do what they're asking you to do. And she said, but I haven't taken the test. I said, that's because you have standards. And I know you have standards, which is the only reason why I would suggest this job for you, because they will just take anyone, because they are going to take whoever is the first one to get up there, because they're looking for somebody to meet that need of be in this room at this time with these people. And so I see that these things are happening. And you may say, well, that's education. That's not accessibility. It's the same thing. Do you have access to proper education? Do you have access to, the same science class that Timmy is getting? It's the same science class that Sally's getting. Are they getting are we equal in what is being taught? Because if accessibility is lacking, it's not. So we need those equitable accommodations. And I know we talk about like ADHD and this and that. If we have accommodations for everybody in the room, the deaf kid should get that too. And not just what we think is best, but what he thinks is best, what the student thinks is best, what the advocates have said is best, what the deaf community says is best. That's who we need to be looking for. So we need to stop looking around to the hearing people to say, "Oh, what's the best source?" And I know that sounds like ridiculousness coming from me, a hearing person, but I am who I am. I do have a deaf heart, and I do want to see a change for the better. I want to see qualified interpreters. I want to see qualified educators. I want to see understanding in the classroom. I want students to have a safe space to grow into that deaf community, to be connected with the deaf community. I mean, think about it. How many children, if they're born deaf or become deaf or they're hard of hearing at those early ages, how many of them are hanging out with deaf community members who are 20 years old, 30 years old, 40, 50, 60, because they're living in a world surrounded by hearing people and their decisions are being made by those hearing people? Where we should be connecting. We should be forming community all over, and we're dropping the ball. And so I guess I'm just really challenging those who can make the change to make the change. If you know a teacher of the deaf who doesn't know deaf history, challenge them. Ask them questions and then go and say, "You should know this." Send them a link to the book. Send them the book. I mean, honestly, I don't have a lot of money in my bank account. Like, I'm not one of those hoity-toity people. But if somebody came to me and said, "Jewel, I want a book on deaf history," I will buy that book for you and send it to you. I'm not giving you my copy. That's a hard pass. That's mine. You have to pry it from my cold, dead hands. But I will get you that book. Now, if 500 of you tell me that, we might have to like figure out some sort of deal here. But if you're like, "Whoa, I want to know," I'll get you the book. Yes, let's learn. Let's grow. Let's be together. Let's learn deaf history from a deaf teacher. A teacher of the deaf who himself was deaf, who went through this, who learned, who understood, who grew, and was strong enough and bold enough to call out his teacher, his own establishment, to say, "You did it. You missed it." That's the person we need. And I thank Harlan Lane for going ahead and putting it together so that the rest of us can enjoy it. So I want you to think about these things. Where's your history coming from? Where are you learning these things? Yes, you're learning it from me and I'm hearing, but I'm citing a deaf person for once, unlike history. So I would love for you to learn some history of the deaf community. I would love for you to read that book and share your responses, share your thoughts, share your own videos, share it with your friends and family. The other book of his is The Mask of Benevolence. Please read that one. Please read that one. Um, the just there's a lot out there. There's a lot out there, and vet the sources. Understand where it's coming from. So, thank you for letting me rant and rave as I typically do. And let's make sure that deaf education is equitable and equal and surpassing, depending on where you live. Let's focus on that education and focus on understanding death history from the right historians. So, thank you very much. Have a great day.